Hi everyone, my name is Kara Pavelko and my partner on this presentation is Susan Anton Clancy. We research the Connecticut State Policies for including students with disabilities on statewide assessments. In this presentation, we will review mandates for students with disabilities to be included in statewide assessments, accommodations and modification policies, embedded and non-embedded accommodations, and we will review the Connecticut Status Report of Students with Disabilities. An overview of assessments. So statewide and nationally, districts, states use assessments as the barometer for evaluating school districts and state public education performance standards. In particular, this measures the goals of reading, math, and science. And these evaluations or assessments, rather, help inform instruction. And they can help with school reform, particularly if the assessments fail somehow or the data that comes back is not in line with the outcomes. Um, Again, progress monitoring, it informs all sorts of things. And we want to make sure that the assessments really measure the literacy skills, which are super important in Connecticut, and math and science skills. So these assessments are really the cornerstone or the nucleus for Connecticut public school assessments or progress for students. The Connecticut Alternative Assessment for students with disabilities. This was formed, excuse me, with the National Center State Collaborative to create a comprehensive assessment system for students with significant cognitive disabilities. The U.S. Department of Ed provided a grant in aid and collaboration with the 25 states and organizations to be able to administer these tests. These assessments are administered to grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. And the assessment, again, aligns with the measurable assessments of Connecticut core standards related to grade level. And we know that the alternative assessment does have some modifications and accommodations, which I will get to in a couple minutes. Accessibility features provided are embedded in assessments, and non-embedded tools are provided for completion of the assessment. And the long-term goal really is to ensure higher academic success, enabling students to pursue post-secondary education and training opportunities. So these assessments really just give a baseline for where students are cognitively and assess their skill sets. And in the long term, these may change, their assessments may change by delivery of the education, their academics, strategies for behavioral and cognitive exercises, and so on. Okay, so eligibility for students who receive assessment accommodations. Students that receive accommodations it's really determined by their PPT, their planning and placement team, which includes, as we know, parents or guardians, and those that are engaged in the decision making of the student, right? And is included in their individualized education plan. So we know that some of our kids that have an IEP, right? They might be multilingual English learners, maybe intellectual impairment or intellectual disabilities. Cognitive functioning may be lower than their peers. Adaptive behavior could consist of like conceptual, social, and practical skills, may not meet daily requirements. They require intensive individualized or small group instruction. They have adapted materials. For instance, in reading, maybe a student will get EdMark assistant or have a math disability and receive tier 3 supports for those types of things. And students who are blind or deaf may need assistive technology. So the assessment accommodations are, well, I will say the types of tests or assessments that Connecticut administers, the three major ones. So it's the Connecticut Smarter Balance administered in grades 3 through 5. The Next Generation Science Standard, also known as the NGSS, administered in grades 5, 8, and again in grade 11, and the Connecticut SAT administered in grade 11. So the IEP team will establish what accommodations modifications will be needed for these particular tests and assessment exams. The three main areas presented for the accommodations of our students with special needs are academic, behavior, and environmental. So support categories for students with disabilities in Connecticut, and I had mentioned this previously, some of our students may need presentation supports. And these sort of allow students to access information in ways that don't require them to read standard print. So there are alternate modes of access. Could be auditory, maybe they need hearing implements, multisensory or tactile, or visual. And these can come in many forms. They may have multisensory or prompting. The special education teacher may sit with them, and there may be a presented question on the assessment, and the teacher may have visuals to help them with the actual assessments. Response supports and accommodations. These allow students to complete activities, assignments, and assessments differently, or solve organized problems using some assistive device or organizer. So again, these all may look different. This is up to what is been established in the IEP. Again, this may be a hearing device, headphones, a reader on the screen, something that highlights words, or a reading device. And other support accommodations. We know that, our students with disabilities are not all cookie cutter, right? We have other students who may have ADHD or dyslexia and may require, you know, auditory or visual helpers. And there may be our other friends who have more severe disabilities and may require non-embedded, which are accommodations that are not included in mainstream curriculum. And these may be changes to the environment or changes to devices, depending on the needs of the student. Okay, and this here is a chart that was taken right off of the state of Connecticut students with disabilities, their guidebook, I would say. And here you can see There are the universal tools, and feel free to look this up if you're curious on the actual website, um, the Department of Education website. There are so embedded tools or accommodations, which I was just speaking of. These are things that are available to all students. So, breaks, depending on how long the assessments are. Usually they're done in parts or days. Some of them last for about, I don't know, 65 minutes, and others last, um, 15 minutes at a time, depending on the student and the days given to the student. But anyway, the embedded are breaks. So maybe a student needs to get up, leave the room, take a little walk, use the bathroom. Digital notepads, an English glossary, a line reader, which is very helpful if there's a long passage that a student has to read and it just looks daunting to them. So they use the line reader, which highlights every sentence. And there are several others too. There are math tools. Some assessments allow for calculators. So it really just depends. But those are all the universal tools. And those are the embedded tools in allowed in curriculums. The non-embedded tools could be used for our MLA student, our multilingual student, or our English learner. I think they're called ML students now because we know that most of our students speak more than one language. Our so these are other sort of hearing devices. And voice activators. Um, they may be tactile things, things to touch, visual representations of the questions. They may be shorter, so there may be 5 questions instead of 20 questions. The student may go into a very small classroom and have his or her small little cubby to do the work, or have a special education sit next to them and sort of prompt them on what the question is asking in his or her cognitive level. Okay, let's get down to some laws here. So federal versus state policies on assessments. So we know that federal laws, the federal legislation, right? Those are the laws. And the state really is the one that formulates, and the state agencies, districts, um, and towns, they really formulate the education plans, which is mandated by the federal legislation, but the states, through the state agencies, and they're really enforcing the laws, and they're writing the laws, and they're sort of, the state is really the boots on the ground, okay? So there's more anonymity. And less of this sort of blurred line where, federal say, okay, it's the law that every student is assessed, right? Every student with a disability is assessed in this way. But we know in state and in public schools, okay, so how does that look, right? Yes, every student with a disability needs to be assessed, but the state going into districts, going to special education teachers, having a PPT and IEP, they will determine what the actual assessment is and the accommodations needed for the student, right? So um, the two goals, the I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back to the public law 105, in the state public law 105-17, that with the reauthorization of Individual with Disabilities Education Act, it brought national attention, right, to prioritizing equality and assessing students with disabilities. Um, so because the national, the legislation signed that into law, we know this for a fact that this is a legislative, it's written into the law, but it's the state that carries out the law and enforces those laws and mold it and determine what the law looks like. And I have several of these laws here too, and the goals of the idea here. If feel free to explore that more. I'll just quickly touch on two of the goals of the idea. And this is particular to the state level. The partition of the participation of a high percentage of students with disabilities in standard district-wide and statewide testing and related accountability efforts. And two, the availability of an alternate assessment for those students who cannot appropriately participate in the standard assessment program. Okay, so still a little vague, more anonymity for the state, again, and the districts to mold exactly what that looks like. Moving on. Okay, so what we learned a lot here. Excuse me. Um, it's sort of it's a complicated process assessing students with disabilities. You know, through multiple ambiguous federal amendments to the initial Education for All Handicapped Act in 1970 and the subsequent state laws, state entities have had to pave the way for special education laws. State entities and advocacy groups, major, right? And testing with little day-to-day guidance from the federal government, right? We know the Constitution of the United States does not really have any education specific um, um, amendments. So except for the 14th Amendment has been sort of the staple of special education law. But statewide really and state agencies and groups are really the folks that are going out and making these laws work for our kids every day. And then the Every Student Succeeds Act, yes, requires students nationwide to participate in statewide academic achievement assessments. However, the way that these are assessed, it's very difficult, and I'm going to try to explain this the best way I can. I would say we could say 1%, maybe a little bit more, that are given the alternative assessment. They're grouped together with the 95, we'll say 95% of assessments of the general population students. So we're really not sure exactly how the data from the alternative assessments are really fairly looked at or assessed. And do they really contribute to education reform? Or is it just, sort of a assess the students for the sake of doing it? Just how impactful is the data from our special needs students? Again, Common Core, especially in the state of Connecticut, has these specific academic standards in the general education curriculum. And because of Common Core, I think we sort of expect our students with disabilities to achieve, in some cases, maybe higher than they can. Um, if we're talking about students with intellectual disabilities, or lower cognitive functioning, um, we know that these students, their scores are not really going to do much um, to provoke or promote education reform. Our students with ADHD and other common learning disabilities, they do have the accommodations that can help them succeed and do well on these assessments and promote reform and informed teaching and so on. But just, we were just wondering, and so I think I'm gonna take this a little further, just so I can see what exactly this data, um, from, say, our lower functioning students with disabilities, what does that data contribute to? Um, okay, sorry if I got off on a little tangent here. Okay, and our conclusion here, the two laws, the IDEA of 2017 and the elementary and secondary education, as discussed earlier, they have mandated our students, to students with disabilities to um, achieve certain standards, through assessments. And although accommodations and recommendations may be considered through a performance report, as I stated earlier, we were going through this performance report at the end of the assessments. Um, and I think I touched on it in my last slide, so I apologize. It's assessed with the same frequency as the 95% achievement levels, and that is our mainstream students. So I'm just, the conclusion is, where does that data fall? And how is that data assessed and analyzed? In addition, states have made efforts to develop these alternative assessment policies and procedures that comply with the law. Again, there is no law that mandates what these assessments look like for our lower cognitive functioning students. They are different, depending on the student's needs, disabilities, and student performance. And really, we need more monitoring and state policies and ensuring measurable instruments, to sustain quality public education for all students, and especially for our students with disabilities and lower cognitive functioning. We believe there needs to be more monitoring on these assessments, and specifically for our friends, for our students with lower cognitive functioning. Again, here is our resource list. Feel free to take a look through that, and you can explore more. Um, and there's a lot of good information here. And our references, which is the textbook. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and feel free to leave your feedback, questions, concerns. And again, thank you so much. Good luck to everyone.